Welcome to the Truth and Liberty Show, where trusted leaders bring biblical insights to important issues to help you stand for truth and effect godly change in our nation and in our world.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Truth and Liberty Show. So glad you could be joining us today. To kick things off today, I'd like to ask the question, are we in another Cold War? I think the answer to this question is clearly yes. In fact, I think if we're honest with ourselves, we should say that the Cold War actually never ended. You see, when communism fell, or we say that, well, actually when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, the press and other people celebrated, saying, oh, the Cold War is over, communism is no longer a threat. But what we conveniently ignored was the slumbering giant that was just south of the Soviet Union called the nation of China, or as we used to call it, Red China. You see, China now has been recognized as the #1 threat to the United States worldwide at every level. Before we go any further about this, so let's talk a little bit about what is communism, because I think today we used to all know what it was back in the 1970s and 80s and even the early 90s. But the generation that's being raised today, the young people of this country, they're not even being taught what communism is. I remember one day when my son came home with a homework assignment that called Karl Marx a good-hearted social reformer. Well, communism is the idea first really promoted by Karl Marx. It actually goes further back than that. It's an ancient thing, goes back into ancient history. The first real communist revolution, though, was the French Revolution. But Karl Marx was a German political philosopher in the 19th century who wrote the Communist Manifesto. And in this book, he said that all suffering in humanity, all oppression throughout society, throughout all ages, is a result of economic disparity that's brought about by the haves, or the people with wealth and with what he called the means of production, are oppressing the rest of humanity, the have-nots, who he called one the bourgeois and the other the proletariat. These are fancy words, but a have and have-not fight. And it's all about money. So he said what we need is a system called communism, where everybody owns everything. The state will own everything. He said communism, in a word, is the abolition of private property. So to achieve justice and prosperity for the common man, we need to abolish private property. And in its place, the state, the government, will own everything. The government will control all banking, all means of production. He also taught that religion and God are really a tool of oppression by the haves to keep the haves-not under control. It's called the opiate, or the drug of the masses, and it has to be eliminated too. So we got to push God out of all culture. He said traditional family is really a human-made structure invented by the haves to oppress the have-nots. You see, it's all a deception, he taught. And so the state has to take control over children as well. And we must educate the children and bring them up and give them a new loyalty and training. He said we can't allow freedom of thought, freedom of speech anymore, freedom of media. We have to control it all because it's all corrupted with the poisonous philosophy and thinking, the programming, the mind control of the haves against the have-nots. Marx's theory, of course, is completely ungodly, completely ahistorical, and completely unbiblical. But in the late 19th century, early 20th century Russia, it was a kingdom under a king and a queen called the Tsar, and there was an extreme disparity of wealth where the Tsar and the aristocracy controlled almost all the wealth in the country, and most people lived in what would be feudal conditions, peasant-like, extreme poverty, and a famine broke out, and they were starving to death. And communism, the theory promising a false hope to the ignorant masses, began to spread, and there was a revolution by the party called the Bolsheviks in 1917 that overthrew the government, and the communists took over. Immediately, they began to purge society of all Christian influence, of all what they called intellectuals. They committed mass atrocities. When Stalin was in power, another dictator in Soviet Union, he actually intentionally starved the country of Ukraine, which was part of the Soviet Union, almost to death, killing millions and millions of people. World War II came along, and Russia was the natural enemy of Germany. So the Western allies brought Russia into the alliance, Soviet Union, and we were allied with them. The Soviet Union was a reluctant ally, but after the victory in World War II, the Soviet Union kept Eastern Europe and even half of the city of Berlin, Germany, and they erected a wall between East Berlin and West Berlin called the Berlin Wall. During these years, up to 20 million people were killed in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe by the communist regime. And also in 1948, 3 years after the end of World War II, in China, there was also extreme poverty in China, great starvation. A guy named Mao Zedong became a leader. He was a leader of the communists, and he led the communist revolution in China, and they took over the Chinese government in 1948 and installed a communist dictatorship. Like the Russians, he purged Chinese society in what he called the Cultural Revolution, killing upwards of 60 million people. Communism then was exported by the Soviet Union and China all around the world, especially by the Soviet Union. Countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Chile in the southern hemisphere, several African nations began to fall to communism. In the 1940s, early 50s, Harry Truman invented something called the containment doctrine. And in this, the United States sought to contain the spread of communism through intervention, military and otherwise, around the world. At that time, the biggest threat was perceived to be the Soviet Union or Russia. And so there was a massive military buildup, both in the United States and in the Soviet Union. And the two nations were going at each other in every way possible, except for the firing of live ammunition, at least directly between our armies. A massive buildup in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe, and it was a face-off, really. And this became called the Cold War, cold because bullets weren't flying. Even though there were proxy wars like Vietnam, Cambodia, African nations, Nicaragua, other revolutions around the world where we would supply arms, Russians would supply arms and training. People were being killed. They just weren't Russian and American soldiers for the most part, except in Korea and Vietnam. But in this so-called Cold War, you know, the U.S. would use sanctions and diplomacy and subversion of governments, and Russia doing the same thing. And there was also a buildup of nuclear arms and the nuclear arms race. And we lived in this for decades, a state of incredible tension and fear of nuclear war and annihilation. Leftists in America, typical Democrats, they had no answers. For example, well, they called this thing mutual assured destruction. Our only safeguard is if, well, we're going to destroy them off the face of the earth if they destroy us. So nobody's going to do anything and we'll just live this way. In 1980, the Soviet Union, 1980, invaded Afghanistan, for example. You know what Jimmy Carter's reaction was? Well, we're gonna boycott the U.S. Olympics, Russia, because it's going to be in Russia, so we're not going to go. So there you go, nanny, nanny, boo-boo. Well, Ronald Reagan gets elected president, and he has a different vision. His vision is to destroy the Soviet Union. And in a few short years, with military buildup, economic prosperity, low taxes, great efforts on the world stage, including calling a spade a spade. You remember when Ronald Reagan called Russia the evil empire? And people everywhere were scared to death. Oh, you're gonna cause them to get mad and strike us with nuclear weapons. And then he told Gorbachev, standing at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," because he was speaking truth to power. And within a few short years, Russia basically was starving to death. Their economy was not able to keep up with their military buildup and compete with the United States, and the nation fell. We celebrated and we said, oh, it's the end of the Cold War. But again, we forgot. We forgot about China to the south. Well, what had been happening with China to the south? Well, China had been building its own economy. After its Cultural Revolution, desperate poverty in China. But what happened was, in the 1990s, shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, all of a sudden you started hearing rumblings in America. Oh, the Cold War is over. You know what? We can persuade China China, what they need in order for democracy to come in is they need a good economy. Because when there's free enterprise, then democracy is going to follow. Forget the fact that it's all controlled by these communist dictators. That's okay. So we need to open up trade relations with China and send American factories there and American technology. And so we bought this bill of goods. In 1997, under the Clinton administration, we established most favored nation status with China, and then formal recognition, normalized trade in the year 2000 under George Bush, and China enters into the World Trade Organization. I want to show you what we've done. We've done this to ourselves, ladies and gentlemen. I want to show you a chart here that shows the growth of the gross domestic product in red China. In 1978, their gross domestic product was $150 billion. In this chart, 1985, basically unchanged. But by 2025, China's gross domestic product, going from $150 billion, is now over it's basically at $24 trillion. It's a 20,000% increase. Their per capita GDP, a similar growth. Per person in China. In 1978, it was around $100 and something. Today, it's over $12,000 per person. And you say, well, this is a good thing. People are wealthier. The problem is the wealth doesn't stay in the pockets of the average Chinese citizen. It is funding the largest military buildup in history. China now has an army of over 3 million people. They have over 400 warships, countless airplanes. They're now engaged in the space race with us. They've built up their nuclear arsenal to where now they could annihilate the United States if they wanted to. They spent over $1 trillion in the Silk Road Initiative on we call it Belts and Roads Initiative as well, going around the world, spreading Chinese influence, subverting nations, turning them against the United States. They've spent $418 million on United States elections from 2016 to 2022. They've got an espionage network in the United States that is scary, literally, doing things with impunity in America. And they are literally trying to subvert us. And Rudi Deutsch, a communist in Germany in 1967, coined a phrase called the Long March Through the Institutions. And this has been attributed to Antonio Gramsci, another communist. But the idea is this, that we're going to infiltrate America and the West, and we're going to subvert them and turn them into communist nations by subverting their institutions. And I'm out of time in my monologue today to talk about this further. There's much more to say, but I've invited my good friend and Truth and Liberty board member and extremely phenomenal historian, Bill Federer, on the program today to talk about this subject of communism and its infiltration in America. Bill has written a book, he's written dozens of books, but he's got a book called Socialism, From Plato to the Present, that everybody needs to get. And also I want to recommend today that you get a book called The Naked Communist, written in 1958 by a guy named Cleon Skousen, that lists the communist goals for America. And it's incredibly enlightening how many of these goals have actually been achieved in America today and why our nation is in such distress. So don't go away. We're going to share a little bit of information with you, and then we'll be right back with this amazing interview of Bill Federer.
Darkness has attacked our nation, but God is raising a standard. Now is the time to wake up and shine the light across America and around the world. Believers are fighting back, eyes are opening, hearts are changing, and Christ is being proclaimed. In government, education, family, media, and the church, we are mobilizing to engage culture with truth. Go to truthandliberty.net.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to Truth and Liberty. Such an honor and a privilege today to have as our special guest on the show, Bill Federer. As I mentioned in my monologue, Bill is the author of dozens of books. He's an incredible historian, and he's a member of the board of directors for Truth and Liberty and a good friend. Bill, thanks for coming on the show again today. It's good to have you.
Richard, great to be with you.
Bill, I wanted to talk today about the subject of communism. You know, I'm sure you remember, but back in the 1991, 92, after the Soviet Union fell, everybody was celebrating the end of the Cold War. And even at the time, I wondered, is this really true? What about communist China? It's still around. How can we say the Cold War is over? Sure enough, today, we're staring down the barrel of about 3 million rifles and who knows how many nuclear missiles and bombers and planes and everything else with communist China. Is the Cold War still going on? That's my question.
Yeah, their goals have not changed, but their tactics have. Very similar to Islam. Islam has two different strategies. When they're strong, they would use military. When they would be weak, they would use immigration. And the same way with the communists, right? They're strong, they'll take it. But you look in the Pacific Rim, it's Chinese population coming into all of these Asian countries, bringing money, bringing business, but they get to come in and they get to live there and have kids and families and then get involved in politics. And it's a way to take over democratic countries through population. I recently read about Singapore. There's an island over in that area of the world that's an American possession, and that the Chinese will come over for a 45-day, no questions asked tourist visa, and they would have children born. The hospitals say 70% of the children are from these Chinese visitors, but since they're born on an American possession, they get to be called American citizens. So they go back to China and they never set foot in America, but they can vote in American elections when they turn 18. So these countries have agendas and they take advantage of our niceness. And that's the reason that we need to uh, be strong. Um, there's a quote from Patrick Henry where he said, "Our mild religion teaches us the maxim of forgive and forget and turn the other cheek. We must act this way as individuals, but as a nation, we cannot act this way." When you add the definition of a patriot, we must respond with strength. So it's the verse, and he says, "Observations of this kind are exceedingly unpleasant, but nevertheless necessary." So it's like,
Yeah.
you turn the other cheek, but are you going to surrender your kids' future? And I look back at Hezekiah. He's sick, he recovers, he gets ambassadors from Babylon. They see all the treasures. And Isaiah said, "What do you show him?" He goes, "Everything." And, then Isaiah said, "Well, someday all that treasure is going to be in Babylon with your sons being eunuchs." And Hezekiah's response was, "Well, as long as it's going to be okay during my lifetime."
Mm.
And you feel like reaching through the pages of the Bible and slapping him. It's like when David was told his son with Bathsheba was going to die, he threw himself on his face and fasted for a week. But when Hezekiah is told that his sons will be eunuchs and all the treasure will be in Babylon, he's like, I won't
Yeah.
be around. And so the idea is that as individuals, we can forgive, but you don't want to surrender your child's future. Proverbs says a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. And what greater inheritance than the freedom, especially the freedom to preach the gospel?
Well, yeah, and if we look at Marxism, I remember even when I was a kid, we heard about the hearings and stuff in the United States Senate, the Red Scare, McCarthyism, and it was all painted as sort of this crazy right-wing hysteria that infringed on people's civil liberties that wasn't necessary. But now, 2026, as we look back over the last 70 years, Bill, has there been a Marxist, communistic attack on American culture, infiltration into our institutions, and are we really paying a price for it today?
Yeah, yeah. As a matter of fact, I'll make a little plug. I put together a book. It's called Socialism, the Real History from Plato to the Present. And in there, I talk about Antonio Gramsci.
Hmm.
And he was a socialist that was put in prison in Italy where he died. And he got on the wrong side of people like Stalin who wanted to conquer the West with tanks. And Gramsci was, "You'll never defeat the West on the battlefield. You have to rot it from within. And it's going to take a long time." And his strategy got nicknamed the Long March Through the Institutions.
Hmm.
Lance Wallnau talks about the seven pillars, but you look at society And this Gramsci model is you infiltrate every single sector of society, education, media, both political parties, unions, churches with the social justice, and you rot it from within. You mentioned McCarthyism in the 1950s. The Soviets would do what's called critical theory. So World War II ends, and you have countries in Europe and Egypt and India wanting to be free, and they would set up republics, and they would lean toward the West. But the Soviets didn't like that. Uh, you know, Nazism is National Socialist Workers' Party. It was a nationalist socialist movement. The USSR is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It's an internationalist socialism.
Mhm.
Both of them are socialism. We can't forget that. One was a nationalist socialism, and the other was an internationalist socialism, but they were both socialist. Anyway, so Gramsci said you can't conquer it with tanks, you got to rot it from within. And so in the 1950s, the Soviets would send KGB agents into countries in the West to do what's called critical theory. You simply observe all the groups in a country, all the political groups, the racial groups, the economic groups, the religious groups, and you take your time and you categorize them as victims or oppressors, haves and have nots. And then you would identify the influencers of each group. And they would do what's called an influence campaign. They would want to befriend this person, whether they're in the media or what. And they would invite them in Hollywood. They would invite them to their parties. And you'd get these Hollywood producers and actors and actresses going to these parties, and they would become friends with these socialists, and then sure enough their messages would find their way into the movies,
Mm.
and it would sow division. So this critical theory is you divide the country into groups, and then you begin to pit the groups against each other, and you begin to stoke the media until it breaks out into violence. Why violence? Because then people think emotionally and not logically.
Mhm.
My friend just got killed. I don't want to sit down and talk theory. And so this emotion, people want to blame somebody.
For
And
sure.
once you get it into that state, it is like liquid cement. It can flow. And so they would control the media uh, through bribes and threats and channel all that emotion toward the new leader of the new republic. And as people began to believe that this leader was the problem, his popularity would fall. And when it fell enough, they could do a coup or a rigged election and nobody would question it because by this time they didn't like the guy, and they would replace the leader with a Soviet puppet.
Mm.
And country after country would fall. It's called Behind the Iron Curtain. And so the Truman does nothing. He thinks the United Nations that he helped form would bring world peace. So he's like standing by doing nothing while country after country fell. Eisenhower is the next president. And in the 1950s, he's faced with more countries going to communism or him doing something about it and fighting fire with fire. And so he has the head of the CIA is Alan Dulles, and he gets Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, and who's an expert in foreign languages, and sends him over to Tehran to do critical theory in reverse. Now, if I can take a moment to give the backstory of Iran. Um, so you had the uh, Qajar dynasty, Qajar, from the 722 up until 1925.
Mm.
And, it had Abbas the first and all these different leaders. But in 1925 is when a general named Reza Shah seizes power. But then when World War II starts, Britain and its ally, the Soviet Union, that's right, the Soviet Union allied with Britain and America at the beginning of World War II. Well, Britain and the Soviet Union team up and infiltrate Iran and stir up a coup and overthrow Reza Shah and replace him with Mossadegh. And so Mossadegh is in charge. He kicks out the Germans. But after World War II, Mossadegh begins to lean toward the Soviet Union. Then Mossadegh nationalizes the oil in Iran. What does that mean? That means he seizes all the refineries. Well, the problem was in 1908, Britain formed the Anglo Iranian Oil Company. Winston Churchill changed the British Navy from coal to oil, but there's really no oil in Britain. And so in 1908, Britain teams up with Iran and forms the Anglo Iranian Oil Company, 1908. But when Mossadegh seizes all the assets and seizes all the oil, Britain is having an oil shortage. So that's when they appeal to Eisenhower, who does Operation Ajax and sends over Kermit Roosevelt Jr., and they orchestrate the same critical theory stuff that the Soviets were doing, but they do it in reverse. And they divide the country into groups and they pit them against each other. And they organize, mobs raiding mosques, and they blame Mossadegh for all the problems. And when his popularity falls, they put him under house arrest, lock him away for the rest of his life, and replace him with the son of Reza Shah. And his name is Reza Pahlavi Shah. And
Yeah.
so Reza Pahlavi was in for 37 years, and he loved America. And he's meeting with Truman and Eisenhower, and he's meeting with Kennedy, and he even gets Cadillac to let their Cadillac Seville be manufactured in Iran.
Hmm.
And he's bringing, Western style, letting women have freedom, and it had the fastest growing economy in the world at that time. I mean, it was just amazing what he was doing. Um, but then you have Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter decides the BBC came out with all these letters and articles where the Jimmy Carter was corresponding with the Shah, who was exiled for 15 years in Turkey and in France. And Jimmy Carter agrees to tell the US to not support the Shah, sends people over there to tell the Shah that he needs to take an emergency vacation to America, to California. And then Jimmy Carter allows the Ayatollah to take power in Iran. And so whenever you see Khomeini killing hundreds of thousands of people, and Iran supporting Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, and Iran you can thank Jimmy Carter.
Hmm.
He's the one responsible for us abandoning the pro-American Shah, Reza Pahlavi. Now, I've met Reza Pahlavi's son in Maryland years
Mhm.
ago at a meeting, and he grew up in America, and he still keeps in touch
Yeah.
with the politics over there, and he's a unifying figure. During those riots recently, they were holding up his picture.
Hmm.
He's the one that all the different fragmented groups will agree upon because they remember those 37 years when they had prosperity.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
So,
Well, so what about in America now, the sort of conflict theory that you're talking about, is that going on in America today? Have the communists infiltrated here? Because a few days ago was Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. Every January we do that. And your American Minute talked about the civil rights movement and how some of the black leaders of the movement were saying the liberals that are infiltrating this movement are Marxists, and they're standing for things we don't believe in, and they're co-opting this, taking it a direction that we don't agree with. Can you comment further about that and Marxist infiltration in America?
yeah, so the Marxist movement in America, because of our economy, people were moving up the economic ladder pretty fast. So they couldn't use economics as a dividing tactic in America. And so they had to look for other different things to divide the people over. And it was Stalin that chose race. And so one of the leaders in America that was a communist in New York, um, the Republican Party was Lincoln's party and freed the slaves. And then you get to the 1930s, and the Republican Party were more or less taking the blacks for granted. And you had some black leaders saying, hey, maybe we'll switch to Democrat. And so you had during this time, some black leaders actually became communists. And then they later left that and said that the Democrats were basically communists. But one of them was Manning Johnson. And he lost his faith in America, joined the communist movement, ran for Congress in New York in 1935 as a communist. And then he realized that the communists really didn't want to help the black community. They just wanted to use the black community to sow division. And he talked about how some black leaders wanted to have a real estate development and have it be really nice. And he saw these communists torpedoing it. And then some black leaders wanted to have a hospital. They said, Catholics have hospitals, Jews have hospitals. We want to have a hospital. And he saw these communists torpedoing it. And they're like, you don't really care about us as a people group. You just want to sow division. So Manning Johnson wrote this in a book called Color, Communism, and Common Sense. And he says, 10 years later, though thoroughly disillusioned, I abandoned communism. The experience of those years in outer darkness were a horrible nightmare. He goes on, by the way, Teddy Roosevelt's son, Archibald Roosevelt, uh, I apologize for that. Archibald Roosevelt wrote the foreword to the book. Um, and so John Manning Johnson writes this. To me, the end of capitalism would mark the beginning of an um, interminable period of plenty, peace, prosperity, and universal comradeship. So he's talking about being a communist when to end capitalism. All racial and class differences and conflicts would end forever after the liquidation of the capitalists, their government, and their supporters. Being an idealist, I was sold a bill of goods. Like other Negroes, I experienced and saw many injustices and inequities around me based on color, not ability. I was told that the decadent capitalist system is responsible. And
Mm.
anyway, so he was enmeshed in this red conspiracy. He even went over and was trained by the communists. And then when he left, he says, I saw communism in all its naked cruelty, ruthlessness, and utter contempt for Christianity and the low value placed on human life. He goes, after 2 years of practical training in organizing street demonstrations.
Mm.
So here he is
Practical
talking
training.
about how, as a communist, they were taught to organize street demonstrations. He goes on inciting mob violence, how to fight the police, and how to politically, quote, throw a brick and hide.
Mm.
I was given an intensive course in the theory and practice of red political warfare that changed me from a novice into a dedicated red professional revolutionist. And so these tactics, these are training people how to fight the police. He explained further, and this is the book he published in 1958, Color, Communism, and Common Sense. He said, I began to realize the full impli- implications of how the Negro is used as a political dupe by the Kremlin hierarchy. He goes on, the white, socio liberal, philanthropic, humanitarian supporter, when communists unite with and support them today, it is necessary to keep in mind that it may be necessary to denounce them tomorrow and the day after tomorrow to hang them. So he's like, okay, we'll use you
Hmm.
for the purposes, but then we'll turn on you. He goes, then the white leftists descended on Negro communities like locusts, posing as friends, come to help liberate their black brothers. Everything was interracial and interracialism artificially created, cleverly devised as a camouflage of a red plot to use the Negro. So this is Manning Johnson,
Wow.
but another black leader was Malcolm X. And he said the same thing in 1963. Malcolm X said, the liberal is more deceitful, more hypocritical than the conservative. The white liberal is the one who has perfected the art of posing as the Negro's friend and benefactor by winning the friendship and support of the Negroes, while the white liberal is able to use the Negro as a pawn or a weapon in this political football game that is constantly raging between white liberals and white conservatives. The American Negro is nothing but a political football, and the white liberal controls this ball. And he goes through tricks and tokenism and false promises of integration and civil rights. The white liberal has complete cooperation with the Negro civil rights leaders who sell out our people for a few crumbs of token recognition, so forth. So here we have the socialists with their critical theory looking at countries and saying, what can we divide? In Serbia, it was the different ethnic makeups. Bosnians and Serbs, they sort of, look the same to outsiders, but they know the differences. In other countries, it's the Sunni versus the Shia or the Greek Orthodox. But in America, they look at it and says, what can we use to try to divide America? And Manning Johnson said it was Stalin himself that picked the race issue.
Wow. That's amazing, Bill. No, so my follow-up question then is, in America, have the communists have they now exploited other groups besides just the race card? Are they now exploiting others? And most importantly, I'm thinking of the LGBT group, and now maybe illegal aliens and this sort of thing. Have they increased this sort of critical race and conflict theory in our country?
Yeah, yeah. So they would want to the feminist movement. They wanted to get the men and women to fight each other, and then separating children from their parents. You teach the children you can't trust your parents, and you got to believe us. And so they want to sow division in families, racial divisions, religious divisions, and that's where you get the woke church stuff. Matter of fact, Manning Johnson talked about this tactic. He said how social justice, he said, instead of for God so loved the world, woke churches would transform Jesus into a Palestinian agitator. And he talked about large numbers of Negro ministers fall for this and using the race angle as bait. And so the new line is this: Jesus, the carpenter, was a worker like the communists. He was against the money changers, the capitalists, the exploiters of that day. That is why he drove them from the temple.
Mm.
The communists are the modern day fighters against the capitalists or money changers. If Jesus were living today, he would be persecuted like communists who seek to do good for the common people. All of their methods used, it was generally agreed the church is the best cover for a legal book. Anyway, if you read the news, the recent church that was disrupted in Minneapolis, one of the rioters said that, well, Jesus went into the temple and overthrew the tables.
Mm.
Right. So they're still teaching this, that I'm a Christian because I am disrupting things, not realizing that they have been duped by communists. Now, it's not just me that has observed this. In 1963, Albert Herlong, a congressman,
Hmm.
reads into the congressional record the 45 goals and tactics that the communists had to divide America and to bring this division so they could institute communism. And so this is January 1st, 1963. Uh, One of the points: discredit the Bible, infiltrate churches, replace revealed religion with social religion, right? Social justice. And the ultimate of this is liberation theology, where you can kill. Um, and so these tactics have been applied on us. For the most part, they in 1950s they infiltrate Hollywood. We get all these leftist movies, and Eisenhower gave a quote in Time magazine. He said, "No group like the communist conspiracy can use the freedoms of the Bill of Rights as a privileged sanctuary from which to wage war to destroy the Bill of Rights." You
Right.
can't come into the country and say, well, we want all the freedoms. We want freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of press. We want all these freedoms so that we can overthrow the country and take away the freedoms.
Mm-hmm.
It's like Islamists say, we want freedom of religion, but when we come into your country and take over, we're not going to allow any more freedom of religion. And
Yeah.
all you have to do is look at 1,400 years of track record, how Egypt used to be Christian for 6 centuries until the Muslim leader Amir ibn al-As invaded. And the Muslim leader al-Hakim actually cut out the tongues of anybody caught speaking the Egyptian Coptic language. So they brought in a whole new language of Arabic. All of North Africa was Christian. St. Augustine of Hippo was from Carthage. It was all conquered in 10 years by the Umayyad Muslims.
Mm.
Then they invaded Spain in the year 711, conquered all of Spain. Then they conquered Syria. People forget Syria was the first country to completely be Christian,
Mm.
evangelized by the Apostle Paul. The name Christian was first used in Syria until Caliph Umar conquered it in 648 AD. And then, of course, the Turks convert to Islam and they invade into what is today Turkey. Back then, it was the Byzantine Empire. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were conquered. And so we see these tactics that wherever Islam comes in, the non Muslims are a second class citizenry called dhimmi that have to pay the taxes to support their Muslim oppressors.
Mm.
And if you don't have any money to pay, you're no longer part of the agreement and they can sell you and your wife and kids into slavery. And so this ties perfectly with socialism. Socialism wants to take money away from capitalist enemies and then funnel the money to their socialist supporters. I thought it was an interesting article that Mondami, after being elected mayor in New York, is now living in a palace, right? He's living in a mansion. Um, and so the idea is that the ruling class gets to have all the benefits, but they take money away from their. It's very similar to during the Revolutionary War. John Paul Jones was an American pirate robbing British ships. And when he would capture a British ship, full of all kinds of guns and supplies, he would give the ship to George Washington, which was great, right? But it's this idea that you can co-opt what was intended to supply your enemy and use it to supply yourself. Well,
Mhm.
they use this sort of in their own world to take money from the dhimmi or the non-Muslims, or take money from what they call capitalists, and funnel it to make an oppressive power uh, over us. So we see a working together of these tactics of Islam and communism. Both of them want a one world government.
Yeah.
Um, in Islam, they it's a religion of peace, but their definition of peace is when the whole world submits to the will of Allah, there'll be peace.
Yeah.
So to them, world peace means world Islam. Communists have a word called mir, M-I-R, and it means world peace, but it also means world communism.
Hmm.
So communists
Yeah.
are for peace, but their definition of peace is when the whole world becomes communist, when all private property is gone. Then there'll be this wonderful utopia.
Yeah.
It, it, it doesn't matter if private property is gone or not. The question is who controls it.
Mm.
And so if everybody's property is put together, but somebody in the government decides who gets what, guess what? They're the dictator. The saying is, he who holds the purse strings has the power. So we see this similarity. They call it the red-green axis.
Hmm.
So red being communist and green being Islam. They're both happy to work together against Judeo-Christian Western civilization that believes in the individual having rights from a creator. The creator is not a respecter of persons, and you get to benefit from your hard work, and you get to trade with other people without government intervention, and you get to defend your wife and family, and you get to set up a government from the consent of the governed. And so they'll fight together against us. If and when they would ever win, they'll fight each other.
Yeah.
Um, but this is where we're at.
Well, Bill, the Chinese, China has been recognized now as America's #1 security threat on the global stage, and the list of the things that they have done and are doing to adversely impact America's stability and economy, is really long. But there was a book or a paper that was published by a couple of Chinese military officers called Unrestricted Warfare in the late 90s, I think. Are you familiar with that? Can you comment on it? And are we really in a state of warfare with China now, just that there's no bullets flying?
Yeah. So you have traditional warfare, which is on a battlefield with weapons. And then beginning with Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, he came up with what's called the fifth column. So traditional warfare, you have two columns, two flanks, but what's the fifth column? It's your soldiers inside the enemy camp,
Mm.
undetected, and they're sowing division, they're sowing confusion, they're weakening the enemy from the inside. So in Athens, Philip bribed some people. There was no king. You had 6,000 citizens, and all the citizens would meet together in the Agora marketplace and talk politics. Word polis means city. Politics is the business of the city. And it's the 6,000 citizens that are to decide. Well, Philip of Macedon paid some of these citizens to stand up in the Agora and sow confusion. So when everybody's saying, we got to get our army together, we got to get our navy, Philip's on his way here, these people would stand up and say, wait, wait, wait. I hear Philip's not such a bad guy. Let's not get carried away. I hear he's not conquering cities, he's liberating cities, and the people actually like him. And then these paid propagandists would gather around themselves what Lenin later called useful idiots. Low IQ people, right? Students that believe the lies. They're
Mm.
standing out there with their signs and they're like, why are you here? I'm not sure. Somebody told me to stand here. I'm getting paid, right?
Yeah, free
And
Palestine.
so, when, yeah, from the river to the sea, what river, what sea? I don't know. And so you confused the city. And then when Philip marched up to the walls, they threw the gates open and he took over. And so this idea has been perfected through the centuries. And the idea is that you can fight on the battlefield, but what's better is win without a fight. So you had uh, a European military theorist named Clausewitz, and Clausewitz gave the classic purpose of war. The purpose of war is to get your enemy to submit to your will.
Mm.
Pretty simple.
Yeah.
All the fighting, all the weapons, all this stuff, but the goal is get your enemy to submit to your will. Well, Sun Tzu's Art of War, China, 5th century BC, said supreme excellence in a commander is to get your enemy to submit to your will without a fight.
Mm.
Wow. So if you're really good, you'll just psych your enemy out. You'll make yourself appear everywhere and you're stronger than you really are, and you'll make them can be convinced that they're weak, and you'll move your troops around and they'll think you're everywhere. And it's sort of like what Robert E. Lee did to McClellan at the beginning of the Civil War. McClellan had hundreds of thousands of Union troops, but the Confederates would march their troops to the top of a hill and then march them back and then move them over a quarter mile, watch them up to the top of another hill, move them back. And McClellan's like, they're everywhere. And of course, Lincoln finally got rid of them and says, I want somebody that can fight. And but this idea, now it's called fifth generation warfare, where you get your enemy to surrender without them even realizing they're in a war.
Mm-hmm.
If the goal is to get them to submit, why even bother waking them up? Just get them to submit without you get them all into fear and panic. The world's going to end if we don't surrender all of our freedoms to the state. Everybody's going to catch a disease unless we obey the state. The climate, it's one crisis after another. And then when you study the history, it's the actual creation of the crises on purpose. It's sort of like the old cattle rustlers would, shoot the gun in the air to scare the cattle so they'll move in the opposite direction toward where you want to, put them in a fenced in area or something. But you create a crisis to move populations to surrendering their freedom. And so we go from the warfare to the fifth column warfare to your get your enemy surrender without a fight, Sun Tzu, but then the fifth column, the fifth generation warfare is you get your enemies surrender without them even being aware they're in a war. And it's a psychological thing.
Wow. That's amazing.
And it's even in the Bible.
Yeah.
You see the 12 spies going to the promised land, 10 come back with a negative report, and they spread this fear. And all of them begin saying, there's giants in the land. The land devours the inhabitants thereof, but let's stone Moses and go back to Egypt.
Mm.
And God was so mad that he said, every one of you is going to die in the desert, and
Yeah.
bring your kids in. But they succumbed to a psychological warfare. And then Gideon did it in reverse with 300 against 100,000 Midianites. And they blew trumpets and held torches, and the Midianites mentally caved. And so the situation is they are messing with our minds. And these tactics have been perfected during the Cold War. And it was Obama that turned all these tactics inward on the American population with the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act. The Smith-Mundt Act was passed after the 1950s, and everybody was aware of the CIA creating media to try to convince the Americans of the Soviet threat. But then when the liberals found out about that, they said, we don't want the US, the CIA creating media. So it tied the CIA's hands. But Obama had the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act, which gave him the authority to have the government create media and filter it out. So you have the Carl Bernstein, Watergate reporter. He did an article in Rolling Stone magazine, 1977, titled "The CIA and the Press."
Mm-hmm.
And he's saying, yeah, the CIA has 400 assets in the media.
Wow.
So radio, TV, print. He said that they have, your Washington Post, your New York Times, and they'll feed. The CIA will feed the stories to the reporters that'll weave those talking points in.
Yeah.
But Obama officially brought it back. He did I think it was 2014, an executive order called Using Behavioral Science Insights for the benefit of the American people. What's behavioral science insights? Well, you read it, it's
group
studying how people make decisions and influencing them to make decisions. And it's like,
Yeah.
And then you have the Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act that Obama signed that gave him the authority to decide what's disinformation and cancel it and to magnify the voices that he wants. And these are deep state people. Trump has been trying to fire them. We got rid of the Voices of America and NPR and the Public Broadcasting Corporation, but the president can only fire about 10% of the government bureaucracy. So you have these deep state people embedded in there that are leaking stuff. Whenever you see the New York Times and Washington Post get stories that are leaked, right? That's the deep state people that could just be a secretary, but she's passing these stories along to resist. Years ago, I spoke with John Ashcroft, and
Attorney General.
I ran for Congress at the same time he was running for Senate, and then I'm on the board of Regent University, and he's a visiting professor at Regent. But he said when he was Attorney General, it was like pushing a rope. He got to choose his immediate staff, but they had to use the bureaucracy. And they would say, get this done. And in the next week, did you get it done yet? No, I'm still working on it. The next week. Finally, you put your foot down, get it done. All he does is pass it to the next desk.
Mm-hmm.
And that guy drags it out. And the term for it is slow walking. In other words, they intentionally want to drag it out for 4 years so it never gets implemented.
Well, Bill,
then we're all upset at our
with 1 minute left in this show, let me ask you about going back to something you mentioned earlier, and it's the Communist Goals for America, published in The Naked Communist by Cleon Skousen, I think in 1961, and then read into the Congressional Record a few years later. I printed that off and was looking at it, and I thought, my goodness, so many of these goals have already been accomplished in America. Do you have the same sense that they have made incredible strides in our country? I'm just going to take an example. Number 20, infiltrate the press. Get control of editorial writing, policy making, gain control of key positions in media. Then we have eliminate laws governing obscenity, break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. Present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. And there's more. Destroy the family and other things like this. Recognize China, normalize relations with China. How far have the communists progressed in their attempt to take down our country?
Yeah. Well, all that is in the book called Socialism, the Real History from Plato to the Present. Unfortunately, they've made very big advances in that. They do something that is called dialectics,
Yeah.
Hegelian dialectics. In other words, they'll get in a liberal and they'll push the envelope on liberal stuff. And they know that the people are not going to like it and that the people will want to go in the other direction. And so they will have pre-prepared a candidate to be the alternative to the liberals, but the pre-prepared candidate is one of their machine. So everybody think, oh, we're going to get the opposite. We're voting for this guy. No, but that guy is already sold out. And so they would do this to implement these tactics you just mentioned, both under the Democrat and Republican terms.
Mm-hmm.
The Democrats a little bit faster, but under the Republicans, they've been now. Now Trump is bucking this in a huge way. He is not a globalist. He's probably the only candidate that did not need to go to globalist billionaires and ask for money. Every other candidate, as good as they are, they need money and they have to get it from somewhere, which means they have to go and indebt themselves. And once you take their money, even the Bible
They own
says
you.
a bribe will turn the heart. And so Trump is unique in world history. We need to realize that. I think he's the one last stand against globalism. If he were gone, they would use all that AI technology. They would track everybody. And I mean, I was with Calvin Robinson. He's a Anglican priest
Mm-hmm.
that you may have seen him, a big, tall, black gentleman, articulate on YouTube videos at Oxford debating the left. And I was with him, and he said, "Oh, I moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan. I can't go back to England." I said, "Why?" He goes, "They'll arrest me." He said, "They've arrested 16,000 people, about 30 a day, for posting stuff online. Some for even as little as liking a post."
Mm.
They're cracking down on freedom so fast in Europe that they want to do that here, but Trump is pushing back.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, I believe that we have a window. If we win the midterms, he can continue this. If we lose the midterms, it may be over. And that's why I'm frustrated that so many Christians have gone back to sleep saying, "Oh, Trump has got this." I said, all they have to do is flip just a couple
Yeah.
congressional seats
Mm-hmm.
and they're back in power and they're going to impeach him and do all subpoenas and it's going to kneecap any agenda and the press is going to go along with it. So this is critical. We need to really wake up the Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Bill, we could keep talking about this all day long. We'll have to have you back on to continue the discussion. We're out of time for today. Brother, thank you for coming on Truth and Liberty. We love you and appreciate you so much.
Well, Richard, it's always an honor to be on. If anybody wants my book on socialism, my website is AmericanMinute.com.
It's an excellent book. I highly recommend it. Everybody needs to get a copy of that. And everyone, thanks for watching today. We'll see you next time here on Truth and Liberty. God bless.